The core function of a democratic government is to protect persons and property. Government intervention in certain industries for this purpose may therefore be necessary. One example of this would be in the regulation of monopolies providing essential services. If I need to have something, for example, water, and there is only one company that I can obtain it from, then that company can provide me with a substandard product, at a vastly inflated price, and I will have no choice but to pay. The company is basically robbing me, and government intervention to prevent this is justified. In practice, that intervention might take two forms. The monopoly might be nationalized, or alternatively it might remain in the private sector, but be subject to regulation. As the objective of government intervention is to prevent the public being forcibly overcharged, the choice of approach will be driven by which results in the lowest price for the customer. History shows that nationalized industries generally provide substandard services at an inflated price, so privately owned regulated businesses will be the preferred approach. However, this only provides a justification for regulation in very limited circumstances. If the service being provided by a monopoly is not essential, then I have a genuine choice as to whether to buy it or not, and so regulation is not needed. Similarly, if there are multiple companies that I can buy an essential service from, then, in the absence of collusion between them, market competition will mean that prices are competitive, and no regulation is required. Governments sometimes subsidize activities that they wish to encourage, for example by awarding tax reductions to organizations performing those activities. If I work in such an organization, or own shares in it, the impact of such a subsidy is that you are being made to pay additional tax, to subsidize my wages or dividends. You may well resent this, and justifiably so, as it does not appear to be equitable. So, are there any cases where such a subsidy might be justified? Well, I previously pointed out the importance of areas such as food production and armament for national security. National security is a key function of government, and it is reasonable for the government to raise taxes for this purpose. So, if necessary, government subsidy of relevant businesses is one way of supporting these key areas. Sometimes a subsidy is provided to a business simply because it is struggling. Now, while providing a subsidy to an unprofitable business may prevent it from failing, it does not make it profitable. If a business is relying on subsidy for its continued survival, then removing the subsidy will cause the business to fail. So, either government continues the subsidy indefinitely, which seems undesirable, or it accepts that failure of the business is inevitable, in which case why provide a subsidy in the first place? You might argue that subsidizing a business is justified, if the failure of that business, and the consequences thereof, would cause widespread economic hardship. However, if an adequate benefit system is in place, then any workers losing their jobs will have financial support while they seek new employment. This does assume that alternative employment is available, and governments can have an impact on this. Consider that governments legislate, regulate, and raise tax, and these actions inevitably have an impact on businesses. When governments are deliberating on whether and how to legislate, regulate, and raise tax, it is reasonable for governments to consider the implications of this for business, and factor this into their decisions. What sort of things might government consider? Well, I value choice. Employment is a key part of the lives of most people, and so creating an environment where people have a choice as to when, where, and how they work, is desirable. So, I want the economy to include a large number of different companies, all looking to hire workers. Conversely, if an economy is dominated by a small number of large companies, this reduces choice. It reduces the choices of suppliers and customers as to who they do and do not do business with. It reduces the choice of workers as to who they work for. Workers in those businesses will typically be further removed from decision makers, and so have less say, and so less choice, in how they do their job, for example because they are required to follow the company's global policies and processes. These are all arguments in favor of an economic landscape populated by many small companies, rather than a few large ones. Now, I do not want to punish success. Large companies become large because they are good at what they do, and provide products and services that people want. I do not think that the owners of successful businesses should be forced to break them up. I do not think such businesses should be subject to additional taxes. But, neither do I want successful businesses to be protected and subsidized, because they are considered too big to be allowed to fail, or sheltered by legislation, regulation, or tax structures that inhibit others from competing with them. I note that regulation, by its nature, favors large companies, which have the internal resource to understand, navigate, and comply with it, and disproportionately impedes smaller companies. This in itself is a powerful argument for reducing the burden of regulation. From time to time businesses will fail. When people become unemployed, this reduces the choices available to them. All other things being equal, I want people's choices to be maximized. Thus, where it is necessary for governments to legislate, regulate, and tax, my view is that they should do so in ways that encourage business resilience. If a business fails because it has misjudged the market, or is no longer profitable, that is all part of the competitive process that keeps the economy healthy. But if a business fails because government policy is encouraging short-term thinking, that is not desirable. For example, I have previously talked about debt. Carrying debt reduces the resilience of businesses. Therefore, tax structures that encourage businesses to raise long-term capital by issuing equity, rather than taking on debt, might be preferred. Similarly, owner-managed businesses tend to prioritize long-term financial stability, whereas remote shareholders often regard a business as a short-term investment, prioritizing immediate dividends. If tax regimes differ by business structure, governments may therefore wish to levy less tax on owner-managed businesses. To encourage investment in companies over the long term, capital gains tax regimes can be designed that impose lower tax rates the longer an asset is held. And this tax can be imposed on investment funds that are buying and selling investments, by taxing transactions and cash flows within the fund, rather than taxing investors on the returns that they receive. As well as the resilience of individual companies, the overall resilience of the economy also needs to be considered. The failure of a business will impact its customers and suppliers, and may cause them to fail in turn. An economy composed of a network of many smaller businesses is likely to be resilient to the failure of a single business. There will be other businesses in that sector that can pick up the slack. Conversely, if an economy is dominated by a few large businesses, and one of them fails, the effects are likely to be more widespread and longer lasting. Such an economy may have fewer business failures, but those failures are much more likely to be catastrophic for the wider economy, rather than mildly inconvenient. Risk to the economy is heightened by the existence of global companies. When businesses typically operated within a single country, if the economic and regulatory circumstances of that country changed, businesses had little choice but to accept the situation, and, if necessary, accept reduced profit margins. Globalization means this is no longer the case. A business can simply move, in whole or in part, to another jurisdiction that is more favorable to it. We see countries competing to create regulatory structures and tax regimes that encourage global companies to operate there. Of course, if a country succeeds in attracting global businesses, that will create employment for its nationals. However, that employment is precarious. As soon as another country becomes more attractive in turn, the multinational corporations, and all the jobs, will move there. And, even while the jobs remain, the profits generated by them will not be spent locally, as they would be with a locally owned business. And, as global companies will seek out low-tax jurisdictions, they are not likely to be paying significant amounts of local tax. All in all, if a national government is concerned about protecting its own nationals, there are good reasons why it might look sideways at multinational companies. Now, the proponents of globalization argue that it drives down prices, which benefits consumers worldwide. And this is true. But that does not mean that for any individual nation the benefits outweigh the risks and costs. Some might say that this is an argument for a world government. My response is that I prefer as much democratic control over my life as I can have, and this drives toward localization, rather than globalization, of democratic structures. And, if the price for that control is a few pennies on the cost of a t-shirt, then so be it. So, if governments bring in laws that, for example, require businesses to be locally owned, or that apply a different tax regime to multinational corporations operating in their territory, I am not necessarily against this. But the practical impact of such legislation on voters does have to be considered. If a country effectively drives out international businesses, and is not able to replace them with local businesses, this is unlikely to be to the overall benefit of its voters. Another contentious issue is immigration. As a voter, my default position is to oppose immigration, for the following reasons. Firstly, increasing the number of voters dilutes the influence of my vote. This is a simple matter of mathematics. If I am one of 10 million voters, I have 1/10,000,000th of a say in who runs the country. If immigration doubles the number of voters, to 20 million, then I only have 1/20,000,000th of a say. So, immigration means that I have less influence over the laws and taxes that I am subject to. You might say that this contradicts my earlier statement, that the electorate should be extended, so that as many people as possible can have a say in the laws that apply to them. But, potential immigrants will only be subject to the laws of my country if they actually come and live here. Once they are here, yes, as long as they demonstrate that they are capable of understanding the issues and making rational decisions, there is a strong argument for giving them the vote. But that is not a reason for letting them come here in the first place. Secondly, immigration is often used as a way to import cheap labor, either because immigrants will accept lower pay, or because they are already trained to fill a particular role, and employers can therefore save training costs. Now, I have a common purpose and solidarity with my fellow voters. Indeed, without this commonality there is no reason why I would agree to be bound by the group decisions we make, and democracy would fail. If some of my fellow voters are seeking work, I therefore would like them to be employed, rather than people who are currently foreign nationals. I want training to be available to my fellow nationals, so that they can develop their skills and so the choice is available to them. Unless there is full employment, immigration undermines this. You might say that preventing immigration reduces the choices available to potential immigrants. And that is the case. But let's be honest. Ultimately, I care most about the range of choices available to me and my family. My friends come next, and then my neighbors, and then my countrymen. Foreign nationals are bottom of that list. Democracy is a mechanism that allows me to form common cause with my fellow voters, to organize the country we inhabit in a way that suits us. Why would I and my fellow voters create laws that favor others over ourselves? Doing so would contradict the purpose of having democratic government in the first place. Thirdly, increasing the number of people in the country puts additional strain on infrastructure. Roads get more congested, housing becomes more scarce, health services become more strained, and so on. This reduces my quality of life. Over time, these problems can be addressed by building more infrastructure. But this destroys open spaces and countryside, which I value. And at least some of the costs of this building program will be funded by increased taxes, which I pay. Now, you may argue that cheap labor means that I pay less for products and services, and that the costs of updating infrastructure will be more than covered by the taxes that the immigrants will pay. The first point is true. The question is then how I balance a small increase in the price of some goods, relative to the well-being of my fellow voters, particularly those that are unemployed. I choose to prioritize my fellow voters. As to taxes paid by immigrants, well, if those jobs went to existing nationals, the taxes generated by them would still be paid. But as there would be no need to build additional infrastructure, overall the tax take could be reduced, and I would be better off. I mentioned infrastructure just now. Governments often get involved in infrastructure projects. I have previously explained why self-sufficiency and resilience, in areas such as energy, are desirable for national security. Government involvement in building the necessary infrastructure to achieve this may therefore be justifiable, if the private sector is not delivering this. Some infrastructure may be required to deliver government services. If the government is going to run a national health service, then it is going to have to build some hospitals. In other cases, the rationale for government involvement is less clear. Consider a major infrastructure project, for example, building a high-speed railway line between London and Manchester. Either such a line is expected to attract enough passengers to make it commercially viable, or it is not. If it is, then building that line should be a risk worth taking for the private sector, and government intervention is not required. If it is not, then, once built, the line will require continued financial support. So, the government will not only be taking additional taxes from you and me to build the line, but also continuing to do so indefinitely into the future, to support expected losses once the line becomes operational. While this is advantageous for the relatively small number of people who use or are employed by the line, it is disadvantageous for everyone else. So why would voters, and by extension the government, support such a project? It is straightforward to charge users of railways, major roads, airports, and so on, at the point that they use the infrastructure. This provides a straightforward way for the private sector to make a return on the investment in building them. In other cases, this is not so. Consider a lighthouse, or flood defenses. Is there a role for the government in building and operating such infrastructure? In cases like flood defenses or local roads, these will in the main benefit people who live in the area. It is therefore equitable that these local people pay the associated costs. If the local people are paying for something that is for their own benefit, then it makes sense that they have the power to decide what they pay for. This can be achieved in a democratic manner, by making local government responsible for building and maintaining any such infrastructure, and allowing that local government the power to raise local taxes to fund this. Lighthouses are different, in that the main beneficiaries are not people living in the local area, but the generality of seafarers, and the owners of those ships. It therefore seems equitable that the shipping industry decides on the extent to which lighthouses are built, and pays the costs of building and maintaining them. However, if you and I are both ship owners, and I build and maintain a lighthouse, this not only benefits me, but it benefits you. So, unless you pay your share, you are gaining a benefit at my cost, and I am effectively subsidizing your business. I am not going to want to do this. Even if you agree to pay a share of the cost, there are many other ship owners, and getting them all to agree to pay their share will be nigh on impossible. Thus, even though it would benefit you and me, and our seagoing employees may be pressing for it, lighthouses may not be built. A rational response to this is to say that this is a matter for the shipping industry, and if it can't get its act together, then so be it. If working on ships is more dangerous as a result, well, sailors can either demand higher wages to compensate, or can choose an alternative, safer, career. In practice, it may be that other parties see an opportunity here. For example, a port that is located on a dangerous shore may consider that building a lighthouse would encourage ships to call there. If the additional harbour fees that this would generate would more than cover the costs of building and operating the lighthouse, then it would make economic sense for the port to build such a lighthouse. Another potential outcome might be that individual members of the public feel that building and maintaining lighthouses is something that should be done to protect lives, and make voluntary contributions to charities for this purpose. If enough people feel this way, then this will lead to lighthouses being built without violating anybody's property rights by forcing them to pay additional tax for this purpose. Infrastructure does not always consist of large concrete objects. There are other processes and structures on which we all rely. Consider the systems that allow financial transactions to be processed. The modern economy relies on electronic transactions, with nothing physical being transferred. This is all very convenient. But it is also all very vulnerable. If everyone's wealth only exists in electronic form, and the records are wiped, then everyone is broke. If people's ability to spend relies on electronic systems, and the electronics fail, then the economy grinds to a halt. There are various things, from solar flares, to computer viruses, to nuclear explosions, that could cause such events. Government may therefore want to ensure that there is some resilience in the system, for example by requiring businesses to continue to accept cash payments and have processes in place to do so that this can be used as an alternative, at least in the short term, if necessary. And individuals may wish to continue to keep some cash in their wallet.